Hello there, and welcome to the Muscombe History Group channel. Hopefully this is a return welcome because you have been watching our programme on the Battle of Jutland. This is the third and final programme on that series, and it deals with the night engagements and the aftermath. At the end of part 2, we left von Scheer clearing the fire from the Grand Fleet and turning south. Jellicoe, in the meantime, has turned away to the east to avoid the determined destroyer torpedo attack which von Scheer had thrown against him. He then reformed his line, brought Beatty down into a scouting position, and also tended to run south. After they delivered their attack, the destroyer flotillas all turned around quickly, got out of the battle area, and again went down to protect the High Seas Fleet in its retreat. And as far as von Hipper is concerned, as soon as Jellicoe turned, he immediately turned away with his battered battle cruisers and set off again to join the High Seas Fleet. And then night falls. Grand Fleet orders do not encourage night engagements. The Germans are known to be better at night fighting than the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy practices long-range shooting, but they don't practice night actions. Night signals are careless because no plan has British fleets in night actions. British ships will usually assume that another ship at sea is friendly, and British capital ships are not even equipped with fighting searchlights. Armoured and light cruisers sometimes have fighting searchlights, but the capital ships are not expected to engage at close ranges in night actions. There are also limited star shells on board all Royal Naval ships, and no regular practice in searchlight and/or star shell gunnery. The German lighter units can actually train night exercises in the Baltic. The Germans practice night actions in and around their harbours, and ships carry night recognition lamps to identify friendly forces. German sorties tend to know that any contact outside port will be with the enemy. German recognition codes must be accurately passed for this reason. German ships practice searchlight gunnery in harbour at close ranges. Adequate supplies of star shells are usually on board, and captains are trained in star shell and searchlight gunnery. Jellicoe now believes that he has the German High Seas Fleet somewhere to his west and is blocking off their route to their ports. Von Scheer has several options. Firstly, he could turn north, go over the top of Denmark through the Skagerrak and go into the Baltic Sea. He would then have all the German Baltic ports available to him. But this would be a long and arduous trip, and not all his battle cruisers would necessarily manage it. Alternately, he can run deep south and pick up the German north coast, travel along the north coast behind the minefields and get into harbour that way. But the minefields near the coast are unreliably laid, and ships might fall foul of running onto mines. Also, this North Sea coast of Germany is treacherous for moving sands, so there's a good chance that some of his ships would actually run aground. The better option would be to come down through the minefield gap and get into port that way. That's the option that Jellicoe and Beatty believe Scheer is going to take. There is a fourth option available, and that's to go across to the Horn Reef Light and come down the Danish coast behind the minefield and get to port that way. But this would involve tangling with the British fleet. This is the route that Jellicoe and Beatty believe von Scheer will take to return to his home ports, and their intention is to cruise down and block this route. At the same time, Jellicoe sends the fast mine layer HMS Abdiel to lay a quick minefield in front of the Horns Reef Light to capture any enemy vessels that might try that as an escape route. Jellicoe hopes that he and Beatty can lay a trap across the route that the High Seas Fleet must follow, and the High Seas Fleet will run into a decisive battle where again the enemy's T will be crossed. The only foreseeable outcome for this battle is the annihilation of the High Seas Fleet. To cruise down to its interception station, Jellicoe has the Grand Fleet divided into 3 units, each of 3 columns. Around them is a cruiser screen to protect them from any night attacks that might occur from the German Navy. And interspersed throughout the fleet are the flotillas of destroyers, again providing protection. HMS Marlborough was hit by torpedo during the last desperate thrust of the German destroyers. At first her captain hoped that she could maintain cruising speed, but she hasn't been able to. So as the fleet travels south, HMS Marlborough slowly falls behind, taking the whole of 4th Battle Squadron with her. 5th Battle Squadron falls back to maintain a protection link. Meanwhile, Admiral Beatty is steaming separately with the 6 battle cruisers to take up his ambush position. An HMS Warspite, although she survived the battering that she took on the run north, has now been withdrawn from the action and is heading back to harbour with a small escort, limping under serious damage. With Jellicoe and Beatty committed to a fast cruise to the south to intercept the High Seas Fleet, von Scheer actually decides to avoid this route, and he heads for the Horns Reef Light, breaking through Jellicoe's line. From here, he will be able to go down the Danish coast behind the minefields and get back to the ports in the Jade Estuary. Towards nightfall, the British return to their previous headings and accidentally find elements of the battle cruisers heading for Horns Reef. At 2020 hours, Beatty's battle cruisers sight and open fire on Hipper, both sides sustaining hits before the Germans turn away. Just as this happens, the 2nd Squadron of pre-dreadnoughts came into view, and they were rapidly hit by British battle cruisers before they also turned away. The British did not follow. At this point, the 2 lines were on a converging course, but despite the British being able to see the German line in the western afterglow, whilst they were being hidden in the eastern dark themselves, Jellicoe ordered the Grand Fleet to turn away to avoid a night action. He was worried by the poor standard of British night fighting skills, and especially worried about the dangers of torpedo attacks. The night actions were as confused as Jellicoe had feared. Jellicoe had no idea of what the Germans were attempting. Admiralty intelligence was of no help, yet Rune 40 do know that the Germans are sailing for Horn's Reef. They just haven't bothered to tell Jellicoe. Jellicoe and Beatty are forming their night cruising stations, and Beatty turns across the front of the Grand Fleet in order to take up the lead position. Von Scheer now orders course for Horn's Reef, and the High Seas Fleet changes direction. SMS Fraulob is sunk by torpedo as it tries to cross Jellicoe's path. The German ships Ebling and Pommane run into each other and both sink, and as the dreadnoughts pass HMS Black Prince, 4 of them bombard the Black Prince until she explodes and sinks. Jellicoe and Beatty briefly turn north where they think the threat is, but the High Seas Fleet continues on its east-southeast course to Horn's Reef. Jellicoe relied on his light cruisers and destroyers to cover the Horn's Reef route. From 2150 onwards, there were a series of light cruiser and destroyer clashes. In general, these were at short range, around 1,000 yards, and the Germans usually got the first shots in. Both sides were sustaining damage. But the only ship to sink was the cruiser SMS Frauenloben, torpedoed by HMS Southampton. Just after midnight, both Seydlitz and Moltke crossed the rear of the British fleet. Both had been sighted, but were left unchallenged by the British battleships, who were afraid to reveal themselves, although the badly damaged Germans would have been easy prey for the Grand Fleet. The 4th Destroyer Flotilla encountered the German van, Westphalen sinking HMS Tipperary, and HMS Spitfire colliding with the Nassau and carrying off a 20-foot piece of her side plating. Spitfire limps back to port after the battle, and only good seamanship and a commitment of her crew saved her from sinking. Westphalen sinks Tipperary. And in the confusion, Aibling was accidentally rammed by Posen. Both ships sank as a result. At 11:40, HMS Broke challenged SMS Rostock. The Rostock opened fire, hit Broke, causing her steering to jam, and she rammed HMS Sparrowhawk. HMS Contest then ran into the back of Sparrowhawk, slicing off 30 feet of her stern. Rostock was torpedoed and sunk for her trawls, and SMS Westphalen sank the destroyer HMS Fortune. HMS Black Prince was blasted at close range by 4 battleships as they steamed past her, causing her to explode. Moments later, the SMS Westphalen sank HMS Ardent. The 9th and 10th Destroyer Flotillas joined up with what was left of the 4th Destroyer Flotilla and crossed the German line, but they were thinking that it was the 5th Battle Squadron. Again, SMS Westphalen punished them for this mistake, damaging HMS Petard and sinking HMS Turbulent. The remaining destroyers failed to make a torpedo attack, nor did they inform Jellicoe of the happenings. Jellicoe gets the Grand Fleet and the battle cruisers ready to block von Scheer's route to port. But unfortunately, von Scheer has escaped and sails down the Danish coast from the Horn's Reef and returns to his home ports. Jellicoe is left at sea with no final battle. Jellicoe's ships are now going to take several days to get home, and they will return in dribs and drabs. Von Scheer, in the meantime, is in port and can talk to the press, winning the propaganda war for the Germans. However, von Scheer knows how close he came to defeat, and how fortunate they were to survive this action. Von Scheer tells the Kaiser, "We must never do this again. We could have lost the war in the North Sea this week." The losses at Jutland deserve to be read. The main British losses were HMS Queen Mary, Invincible and Indefatigable. They were the battle cruisers lost with almost all hands. The German battle cruiser lost was SMS Lutzow, but most of her crew were taken off. Pommern was lost with all hands for the Germans, but she was a pre-dreadnought. The heavy cruisers Defence, Warrior and Black Prince were all lost in various circumstances, again with most of their crews going down with the ship. The light cruisers for the Germans were Wiesbaden, Fraulob, Ebling and Rostock. The British lost the destroyers Ardent, Fortune, Nestor, Nomad, Shark, Sparrowhawk, Tipperary and Turbulent, with few survivors. German destroyer losses were V4, V27, V29, V35 and S48. The Germans had substantial losses of manpower, with 2,551 being killed in the action, but that compared with 6,094 Royal Naval casualties as a result of the Battle of Jutland. The numbers are not in Jellicoe's favour, and Beatty sheds all blame. As Beatty's ships returned to Rosyth, people stood on the Forth Bridge and threw coal down onto the sailors with jeering and catcalls. The press is not generous, and in most papers around the world, victory went to the Germans. And the numbers confirm that the Germans won the battle. But 6,094 sailors dying, whilst it is a serious number, in a couple of months 10 times this number will die on the first day of the Somme. Jellicoe's failure was that he had not delivered the expected annihilation victory of Trafalgar. But Trafalgar, as with most fleet actions of the time, was fought at very close range. Nelson's instruction was that no captain can go far wrong if he puts his ship alongside that of the enemy. Sustained rate of fire was the most important thing, more important than accuracy. No muzzle-loaded cannon firing solid shot can be accurate at ranges beyond 2,000 yards anyway. At Jutland, the fleet action would for the most part be 10 miles and more apart. Ships tried to pair off with an opposite number in the line of battle to exchange shots, but getting too close in the battle line might seriously damage both sides. Accuracy was more important than rate of fire because each shell hitting the target could do massive damage. And the fire control table makes firing more accurate with observations made from gunnery control towers at each end of every ship. The fire control table on a capital ship would take account of the course and speed of its own vessel, the range to the target and the rate of change for that range, the course of the target and the rate of change, the speed of the target and the rate of change. Temperature, humidity and sea state would all play a part in the flight of a shell, so they were taken into account as well, as was wind direction and wind speed, and even the relative rotation of the Earth, because the shells were in air perhaps for 10 or 15 seconds. And from this we'll work out the deflection, the flight time, the gun bearing, the gun angle, ship's angles, the optimum firing time, the shell flight time in reality, and the shell type. And even with this help, long-range gunnery at this time is still difficult. The German High Seas Fleet fired 3,957 shells. 122 of these scored hits. That's 3.39% hits per shot. The Royal Navy fired 4,480 shells, gaining 123 hits, just one more than the Germans. So their percentage hits per shot is down to 2.74%. Working out the winners and losers at Jutland, in hindsight, is even more difficult. The tactical victory undoubtedly went to von Scheer and Hipper, because they sank more ships than they lost, and they apparently retained a fleet in being. However, the Germans lost the strategic battle by failing to break the British blockade, and they were not actually able to put to sea again as a fleet for almost a year. The British press gave victory to the Germans and were highly critical of Jellicoe's caution in failing to smash the German fleet despite having superior numbers. It took several months for the British press to realize that Jellicoe had not lost the battle, and he had not lost the war at Jutland as he might have done. Both Hipper and von Scheer were awarded the highest German award, Ordre pour le Mérite, the Blue Max. Von Scheer was promoted to Chief of the Naval Staff to fight a U-boat war. Hipper was promoted to command the High Seas Fleet. Jellicoe was promoted First Sea Lord, but was forced to retire in December of 1917 on the issue of convoys for merchant ships, and amazingly Jellicoe was against merchant ships forming convoys. Beatty took Jellicoe's place as Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet, and he also became First Sea Lord in 1919. The future King George VI, the Queen's father, was at Jutland, and was mentioned in dispatches as a turret captain of HMS Collingwood when he was still Albert, Duke of York. There were 4 Victoria Crosses awarded at Jutland, to Commander Bingham of HMS Nestor, who was the only VC to survive the action, Commander Jones of HMS Shark, Major Harvey of the Royal Marines on HMS Lion, and most famously, Seaman Jack Cornwall of HMS Chester. Mortally wounded, Jack Cornwall was brought back to Hull Hospital, where he died on the 3rd of May and was buried in a common grave. HMS Chester's first officer then publicised Jack's acts of valour. Most of the gun crew on HMS Chester were killed or wounded in action. On his own, Jack was running to fetch ammunition, loading the gun, aiming the gun, and firing the gun. He kept the gun in action. Jack was recommended for the Victoria Cross. His body was exhumed and given a hero's burial, with his parents present as honoured guests. Jack is the youngest VC of World War I and the 3rd youngest VC ever to win that award. Jutland allowed the blockade to continue to strangle Germany of its imports of food and materials, breaking civilian morale and contributing to eventual victory. The German people realized that the High Seas Fleet was an expensive luxury toy of the Kaiser. This led to riots in Germany's cities and mutineering sailors refusing to sail out to attack the Allied fleets in October of 1918, which led directly to the Germans signing the armistice at 11 a.m. on the 11th of November 1918. 11/11/11/18. The German High Seas Fleet surrendered into Scapa Flow, and then on the 21st of June 1919 was scuttled because the German officers thought the armistice was about to end and they did not want their fleet to fall into the hands of the Allies. After Jutland, big gun battleships declined in importance, becoming more and more vulnerable to aircraft and submarine torpedo attacks. Jutland was not another Trafalgar. It was not a crushing British victory, but neither was it the disastrous defeat that it might have been. HMS Dreadnought, 1905, with 12 10-inch guns in 6 2-gun turrets. HMS Vanguard, launched in 1944, 8 15-inch guns in 4 2-gun turrets. The last battleship to be built anywhere in the world. Perhaps would have been better named HMS Rearguard. "55 years of British battleships." HMS Dreadnought, commissioned in 1905, and HMS Vanguard, decommissioned in 1960. And in between those dates, the biggest battleship battle of history, the Battle of Jutland. Don't forget to press like if you did like it, and click on subscribe if you want to keep an eye on what's happening at the Muscombe History Group channel. That's the end of this series of programs. Hope you'll come back and join us again in the future. In the meantime, all the best and goodbye.